There's a moment on that road trip. I was in New Orleans 3 months after Hurricane Katrina, and
Wow.
they were opening up the Ninth Ward to residents for the first time. And I met this man named Frank, and I'll just never forget the feeling of walking into this, you know, deeply emotional moment of him seeing his house, mud halfway up in his living room, and the privilege of being able to tell his story, the honor of having him trust me to convey this moment. And, I in high school and college, you sort of watch documentaries and you think they're supposed to be made a certain way, and there's talking heads and there's
Right.
narration, voiceover, and just the
Exactly.
power of this moment to, to feel this moment without needing to ask a question, with just letting this moment play out. He ended up sort of talking to himself, to me, to the camera, to the world, and I'll just never forget that moment. And sort of, I always look back and realize like that was the moment that I knew I wanted to do this forever. And again, what a privilege to be able to be able to do it.
You're a midnight blue.
Good day, filmmaker Matthew Heineman. Matthew, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm great. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled that you're here. When looking at your career, it almost reminds me of the Theodore Roosevelt Man in the Arena speech personified. Here's a few places you've been over the past throughout your career: special operations team rooms, President Obama's backyard, front lines of COVID, drug wars. Just the amount of places you've been at the pinnacle of human experience is just incredible to me. Have you thought about how it happened that way?
No, in sort of like a spiritual sense or in a like literal sense? Or, I mean,
In a little, like, looking back at your career and thinking like, these are not just places you can walk into and be like, "Hey, I'm a guy, filming a documentary." It requires, a lot of things to happen to get into those places, and those things happen for you. And it would be sort of a cop out to say, "Oh, it's just luck." There was definitely you don't get into those places without intentionally making career choices that led you there. Can you think about like what maybe looking back, what choices were made that got you into so many incredible places?
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure this is totally answering your question, so feel free to correct me. But I think if I looking back at my career, if there's one thing that sort of ties it all together, it's a desire to take subjects or topics that are often, plastered across headlines or in the zeitgeist of what people are talking about, and trying to humanize them and trying to put a human face to them. Whether it's the drug war in Mexico or ISIS in Syria or COVID or, you know, what any of the various docs that I made, it's trying to take these enormously complex subjects and trying to find, subject participants that I can film that again humanize the issue in a way that I think public discourse has in many ways failed at doing so. And honestly trying to do so in a apolitical way. I have my
Mhm.
own political beliefs. I have my own, upbringing where I came from and all the things that influence who I am as a person. But I don't find myself interesting, and I've very much tried to not make myself part of my films. Although obviously, anytime you press record or change a lens
Right.
or you inject some sense of subjectivity. But yeah, I guess to answer the question, I've just tried to take these really enormous subjects and make them personal and make them intimate and try to get into doors or into rooms or into meetings or into whatever the subject is, into places that cameras aren't necessarily supposed to be in. And hopefully in doing so, allowing audiences to feel like they're there, like they have a front row seat to these situations, these topics.
And so is part of that, you think, just being comfortable with different people? Like, so you went to Dartmouth, majored in history, then got involved in filmmaking. So I see like just a wide variety of like life experiences as part of that. So is part of that that you're able to relate to different people a crucial part of being able to go to so many diverse topics? Like the other part of this is it's not just you're not just covering like international topics, you're not just covering music topics. It's a wide spectrum of things that you are interested in. So did that start at Dartmouth? Did it start, with your parents? Where did that like interest in those types of things, in the wide variety of subjects in the world come from as well?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I didn't know I wanted to be a filmmaker. I didn't study film. I stumbled into film. I studied history in college and got rejected from Teacher America. And, most people didn't know you could get rejected. So I was one of the lucky ones.
Didn't
And
know that.
yeah. And so I had no clue what I wanted to do. And so after that rejection, my three best friends and I decided we wanted to travel, but we wanted to travel with purpose. And so we ended up raising money and renting an RV and buying a cheap video camera and set out on this sort of kaleidoscopic journey across America to interview kids from all walks of life to understand what our generation is about.
It's gonna be our generation turning all this stuff around and like dealing with all the mistakes that like everyone made for us.
What's the name of our generation?
Generation of Hope.
E for digital.
We grew up on MTV and we're all products of ADD.
I think that we're a generation of opportunity.
Young and wild, because why? Because kids nowadays do whatever the fuck they want to do.
What do you think is different about the youth of America today than when you grew up?
They're a little more rude.
We've been called an apathetic generation, a pampered generation, a generation without purpose. So my friends and I decided to find out firsthand how our generation sees itself.
We really need to start moving forward, and if we don't like something, we should fix it.
We drove across the country and back again, hitting all of the lower 48 states.
I've done some pretty rough stuff, drugs, prostitution.
What the point of my project is to come up with new anti-cancer drugs.
Getting blown up by an IED and coming close to dying puts a whole new perspective on it.
This is one of the most rewarding jobs I'll probably ever have in my life.
I feel like I'm coming up in the world, like I'm making money and shit, but at the same time, I'm fucking everybody else's life up.
I think every generation to one degree or another is inclined to say, you have no idea how hard I had it when I was growing up and how easy you had it.
We have an entire world of information at our fingertips. You want to find something out, you go to the internet, you have the answer.
We ran the site originally for $85 a month.
Were you ever in debt?
I mean, I was in debt $160, you know?
From what we're hearing, the youth vote played a pivotal role in President-elect Barack Obama's road to the White House.
We're moving beyond me, and looking at the collective we.
I think the youth of America is about that spark.
I think that we're a generation of opportunity.
The gay generation.
Facebook generation.
Generation of hope. Generation capable.
Excited.
Our generation finally has something to say, in its own voice this time.
Now that everybody's here, and we please have your attention, there is nothing left to fear. Now that banquet is captured, and all the children really light.
And we talked to people from Mark Zuckerberg to drug dealers, to cancer researchers, and that was my first film. That was my film school, and you know, I fell in love with filmmaking through that journey. And so I think obviously a requisite in being a documentary filmmaker is a curiosity about the world. And I think I've had that curiosity probably since I was a little kid. And, you know, I was very fortunate to have parents that imbued that sense of curiosity and stoked that for me. And, you know, every night, every dinner conversation that we had, as a family, my father would ask a question to whoever was sitting with us. And so I guess looking back in some ways that probably had an impact on me, but yeah, I mean, it's such a privilege to do what I do and to do what we do and to tell stories and to gain the trust of subjects in very, very intimate situations.
That's an insane answer. So is that film, your first film, out there somewhere? Did I miss being able to see that?
So I honestly, I need to find it because I've been unable to find it. It was with a distributor that is no longer with us. And so
Wow.
it's somewhere, but I will seek it out for you.
Because that's amazing. So one of the things when I was reading an article you did with A-Frame, you talked about journalistic instincts, and I'm curious how you see the difference between a journalistic film, like telling a story that way, through documentary filmmaking.
It's interesting. I think a lot of people try to put storytelling in sort of into genres or boxes or whatever. And I just don't, it's just not stuff I think about. When I've set out to make a doc, I'm not like, oh, this is a journalistic doc, or this is a, war zone doc, or this is a whatever, it's all of those things. And, I have journalistic instincts, and I have storytelling instincts, and I have romantic instincts and human instincts and French, it's just like, I think my instincts are what have driven me and gotten to me, or allowed me to get to where I have gotten in my career. I've always followed my instincts, and I guess at times they're journalistic, at times they're humanistic. I don't know. It's hard for me to answer that question.
Yeah. So why ask? So when I got my certificate for documentary filmmaking, I remember failing an assignment for like too journalistic, and it makes me curious about this. Like, so have you ever felt like, you got your degree in history. Have you ever felt like you were missing out on like sort of the film school experience, or was that film school experience sort of that road trip and that actually filming, doing films? Have you ever felt like, man, I wish I would have went to film school?
No shade on film school, but absolutely not. I feel like that project was my film school. And I think, everyone has that moment in their lives as filmmakers where they, decide to do it. And, I think film school is incredibly valuable, but it's just not the path that I went down. And yeah, there's a moment on that road trip. I was in New Orleans 3 months after Hurricane Katrina.
Wow.
And they were opening up the 9th Ward to residents for the first time. And I met this man named Frank, and I'll just never forget the feeling of walking into this, deeply emotional moment of him seeing his house, mud halfway up in his living room, and the privilege of being able to tell this story, the honor of having him trust me to convey this moment. And, in high school and college, you sort of watch documentaries and you think they're supposed to be made a certain way, and there's talking heads and there's narration, voiceover, and just the power of this moment to, to feel this moment without needing to ask a question, with just letting this moment play out. He ended up sort of talking to himself, to me, to the camera, to the world. And I'll just never forget that moment. And sort of, I always look back and realize like that was the moment that I knew I wanted to do this forever. And again, what a privilege to be able to be able to do it.
That's an incredible answer, and it just really painted quite a picture in my head. And it alludes to this question of trust. So most of your films, just watching American Symphony again, just amazed by the close-ups. You saw like the trust that was between filmmaker and subject. And I think that's one of the through lines of all your films. So do you have, and you can speak about generally here, have you had like conversations about that topic with the subject beforehand? Are there like contracts? Do you believe that they should be able to see the final take on it just so you're on the same page? Or do you, are basically just like, I'm going to film it the way I see it and that's it? Can you talk about your process of regarding trust?
I mean, trust is everything. It's like any, we all have friends or boyfriends or girlfriends or wives or husbands or, different relationships. And it's very similar in film. And it's, these are, at least the way I make films, like in the case of American Symphony that you just referenced, like, we were literally and figuratively in bed with Jon and Suleika.
Right.
There's no closer place you can get to somebody than being in their bed.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, that trust isn't just given, it's earned. And it's earned through conversations, it's earned through dialogue, it's earned through transparency of intentions. I think, and it's earned through time. Like, I feel like time is a huge factor and allowing me to get what I've gotten in my career and in my documentaries is not just sort of metaphorically helicoptering in for a couple hours and saying like, "Hey, can I hang out with you?" and shooting off a call sheet. It's like really dedicating, like, you know, I'm often shooting 12, 14, 16, 18 hours a day, often 7 days a week when I'm shooting a verite doc. And that allows a few things. That allows your subjects to both get very used to you being around, so that it's just a natural part of what happens, and the case of John, like whenever we get in the car, I'd get into this seat, he'd get into that seat. Like there was just a rhythm to like how life happens when we'd walk in, like, so it wasn't like, oh, let's stop because you have to walk into the room. Like we just had a rhythm, and a rhythm to the day, a rhythm to the shooting. To I don't like the term fly on the wall because fly on the wall implies, no offense to flies, but like a lack of agency. And it's a very participatory process between myself and my subjects. But again, at the center of it all is trust, is them trusting me trusting them. And I think that going back to the time thing is seeing how much myself and my crew are dedicating ourselves to this story, the amount of time we're putting into it, I think shows those who we're filming with how much we care, to get the story right, how much we care to be there for these very human moments, and that we're not just there to like exploit like a gotcha moment, that we're there for the good, the bad, everything in between. And that has allowed me to again get these moments throughout my career.
That's simply incredible, Matt. So American Symphony, how did that come about? Because when I first started thinking I'd love to speak with you, I was fully expecting you to be in Ukraine, sort of following the pattern of like, here's your next film, sort of on the same line as your previous film. And I think throughout your career, you've always sort of zagged, you've pivoted. Can you talk sort of about how American Symphony came to be?
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, it's a huge commitment to make these films, and I definitely don't want to do the same thing twice. And I think that's one of the things I love about this is every couple of years jumping into new, ocean and swimming around and trying to figure out what's going on. American Symphony, I made this documentary called The First Wave about the first wave of COVID in New York City through the eyes of doctors and nurses and patients that we filmed with. And Jon Batiste did the score for it, along with my other composer that I worked with my whole career, Scott Salinas. And so right around it, as the film was coming out, John and I were having dinner one night, actually for the first time. We never really sat down to get to know each other. And during that dinner, he told me about his residency at Carnegie Hall, and this culmination of which was this performance of this symphony he was creating called American Symphony. And so I kind of turned to him, I was like, that's probably something that we should film, right? And he's like, yeah, that could be cool.
Probably, yeah.
And it was right around that time. So we sort of committed to trying out whether, we could make a doc together about this process. And right around that time, Suleika was re-diagnosed with cancer. And so, like most of the films I made, the story, pivoted from this process film to this story about these two incredible humans navigating these highs and lows of life together as a couple. When I was 21 years old, I heard Al Maisel speak, and he said, if you end up with the story you started with, then you weren't listening along the way. And I think that's, beautiful advice for life. It's beautiful advice for filmmaking. Don't be dogmatic, be open to the story changing. And that's something that I've held incredibly close to my heart in a macro sense in terms of what films I choose to make, but in a micro sense in terms of every shoot day, every shot, look beyond the frame. And American Symphony was certainly an example of the story, like constantly changing, evolving, and morphing, and ending up with something completely different than what we originally envisioned.
And it's such an incredible film. I think like many of us, I ended up crying, almost every time I watched it, and got rave reviews. I remember at the time just reading a Variety article about how this is going to be nominated for Best Picture. And then sort of it for whatever reason, things changed. And I just remember reading 1,000 think pieces on, why it wasn't nominated for best documentary. Looking back on that experience, what did it teach you about like the art and the process of awards? Is it even that important to you? Or have you just been able to reflect on it as sort of a interesting part of documentary filmmaking?
Yeah, I mean, I think we put, and I'm certainly guilty of it myself at various stages of my career. Not that I'm like zen and over it at this point, but I think we put an undue amount of weight on awards, and so much of the sort of architecture of the releases of these films and the marketing of these films and the dialogue around these films is, the awards season, the awards run, and all that. And I've been incredibly blessed and fortunate to get the recognition that I've got in my career, but it's certainly not why I do this. And, there's films that got certain awards that, I was surprised by, and other films that didn't get certain awards or nominations that I was surprised by too. So I think if you're making it for awards, then you're making films for the wrong reasons. And I think certainly when I was younger, in my early 20s, in my mid 20s, that's sort of what was driving me, and definitely for the wrong reasons. And then, when I was fortunate enough to get nominated for Cartelland, it, I don't know if it quelled that sort of thing that I was seeking, or made me realize that, my life was the same before and after the nomination.
Right.
I was still the same filmmaker. But at this point, at 41 years old, it's absolutely not what's driving me. I want to keep telling stories that are important to me. I want to keep telling stories that I think matter to the world. The question of why do we make art and who do we make art for is a question that I think as artists we constantly need to be asking. And not that I'm like, again, some like Buddhist master at this point, but as I've gotten older, I think I've tried to make films more and more for myself, and not in like for myself, for my career, but like to answer questions, or to because if the more and more you make it for either awards or for a certain audience, or first, for other people, it just changes the process of your decision making. Because when you're making a film, you're making thousands and thousands of decisions as you're shooting, as you're producing, as you're editing, as you're developing, as you're marketing. So yeah, I think as I've gotten older, I've tried to make films more and more for myself and following my own instincts.
Wow. That that's fantastically insightful. So you talk about just all the different processes of filmmaking, and it strikes me that it's a little bit of a strange type of art, right? Like if you're a painter, you paint, you use the same watercolors that they may have used 200, 300 years ago. If you're a writer, you're not doing anything that different from a writer who wrote 100 years ago. But as a filmmaker, you have to keep up with not only the storytelling aspects of things, as well as, new lenses or new shot techniques, whether you want to use film or digital. I mean, the list goes on and on. And I noticed that you established a great friendship with Roger Deakins, a great cinematographer. So can you talk about how the artistic part of both the narrative and documentaries are important to you? I'm so impressed, like, by the sound in your films and just some of the more technical aspects. So can you talk sort of why that's important to you, and then how you stay current on that, as well as doing all the things you're doing as a storyteller?
Yeah, I mean, I think because of Our Time, which is my first film, that road trip film, I was sort of forced to shoot and edit, produce and direct, and do everything. And that's been a huge part of who I am as a filmmaker. Like I love every aspect of that. I love shooting, I love editing, I love producing, I love directing, I love developing, I love marketing, I love fundraising. Like I love every aspect of that. And I think that's obviously at my core, I'm a director, but being able to cut and shoot really has obviously made me a better director too, and helped me communicate with other, shooters who are shooting with me and other editors who are editing with me. Because I know how to do it and I know how to communicate and dialogue about it. And I think we get obsessed with new technologies, new cameras and new lenses. And, people always talk about like fancy glass and all this stuff. And for me, it's like, these are all just tools. And, uh, I started shooting some stuff on my iPhone and it looks pretty damn good.
Yeah,
It's all
absolutely.
about how to know how to use these tools. And I think most importantly, it's about having these tools be an extension of you so that you are not, if I've never missed a scene in my career where I'm sitting there trying to fumble with figuring out how to you know, change the iris or mix the lob or do whatever, like these are should just be extensions and instinctual parts of you as walking or talking or eating or sleeping or drinking is. And so if you're like trying to use some fancy camera, you don't know how to use it, like that's not what this is for. These are there to help you capture moments of and yeah. And so I've tried to sort of stay away from. I've used the same camera of this Canon C300 and the different versions of that camera since basically Cartel Land, and it's really it's just an extension of my arm at this point.
Incredible, incredible. And I think that's especially valuable for people who are maybe caught up on being able to not afford a red camera or whatever for their indie film. It's like, go tell the story. You don't need necessarily the most expensive gear for it to be seen.
No, and especially for if you're making docs, like the single most important thing is sound. Like if you don't, I care so deeply about my films and how they look, but if they don't sound good and you can't hear anything, then that's a problem. So recording good sound is equally as important to me, if not more important to me, than capturing good visuals.
Incredible. So I'm prepared to be surprised, Matt, by where you're going next. But can you talk about anything that you're working on now that people might be able to see in the next few years?
I just finished a TV series, a narrative TV series, and so that'll come out at some point. And yeah, I'm just I'm feel very fortunate to be able to make both docs and narratives. I want to continue to do so, and just feel very lucky to do what I do.
That's so rare, Matt, because I can't really think of anyone who's able to pivot between both without. I think maybe if you're a narrative filmmaker, very famous narrative filmmaker, you can sort of like do sort of a vanity doc filmmaker, and maybe that's a documentary. But I don't really know anybody who's able to pivot with such strong qualifications in both narrative and doc. Is that just like something you started, interest? Is there any sort of recommendations you could give somebody to be able to follow in that path? Because it's truly remarkable.
It's hard to say. I mean, I think a lot of people use docs as like a gateway drug to Hollywood. And for me, like I had no interest in making fiction, narrative fiction. And then after Cartel Land, I was, very surprised and fortunate to like receive a lot of incoming interest of, from agencies and producers and scripts being sent to me. And I was kind of confused and I didn't really know what to do. And it wasn't really like, part of my dream. I didn't really know. Yeah. It wasn't like part of the game plan necessarily. But then I received the script of Private War, that film I ended up making about the journalist Marie Colvin who was killed in Syria. And I think, if she had still been alive, I probably would have wanted to make it as a doc, but she wasn't. And so this was my way of telling her story, and her story was very moving to me. And in some ways, that film was probably the most personal film that I've made. So I think, yeah, like stumbling into documentaries, I think I kind of stumbled into fiction without any sort of master plan. So it's hard for me to give advice about that. I think it's just, following what moves you and trying to do that.
Incredible, Matt. So this is an indie film podcast. Love hyping other people's projects. It's obvious throughout your films that you take care of your crew, that you're constantly talking with everybody that's working with you and trying to make sure to achieve their goals as well. Is there an indie film or director that you tell your friends like, man, I wish more people knew about them?
So tough. I feel like I have too many friends. I don't want to single anyone out that
Fair.
also
Maybe a genre, maybe make it as like general as possible, but something that you wish more people saw or knew.
I'm not going to answer the question, but I'll answer the question in a different way, which I think two films that had an enormous impact on me early in my career. One of which I think a lot of people have seen is called Murderball, about a group of paraplegic rugby players. And
Great
when I
film.
saw that film, I just, it wasn't that sort of like natural history documentary that you watch in college or high school. It had amazing, unbelievable, protagonists at the center of it that were as interesting and popped off the screen like any movie star did. It had a 3-act structure. It had an antagonist and a protagonist. And I was like, oh, wow, like docs can feel like movies. And it's certainly something that changed my view of what a documentary could be, and also influenced how I ended up making a lot of my films. I want my docs to feel as interesting and compelling as any feature film does. And I think seeing Murderball really had a profound impact on me. A more obscure doc that I think a lot of people haven't seen that I saw early on in my career is Sherman's March, which is unlike any film that I made. It's a very personal film. The filmmaker is at the center of it, but I think it's the curiosity. And basically he set out to make a historical film about following Sherman's March to Atlanta in modern times, which at that point I think it was 1983. And right before he went on this trip, his girlfriend or maybe fiance broke up with him, and so he was heartbroken. And so the film, instead of being this Sherman's March to Atlanta story, ended up being the story of him traveling through the South and finding himself and finding love and just. I think it's a beautiful time capsule, but it's also, this film of discovery. And that's certainly something that I've tried to, as I've talked about earlier, like it ended up being a story that he never thought it would be when he started it. And again, that's a huge part of my ethos. So those are two films that, really impacted me early in my career. And I don't know if I answered the question, but okay.
You answered the question. That was incredible. Matthew Heineman, this has been fantastic talking with you about your career. I would bet you, and I'm sure you won't accept this because it could actually happen, is that you would be the person to do a documentary of like either the space station, Mars, the moon. I mean, who else would be able to do something like that?
I wouldn't be opposed.